Okay. I'm reloaded. Back for day 20 of becoming more well read. Still got Steve Jobs on the platform. We are about halfway. This is a thick book, boy. I thought I would have been done with it by now. But easy work. Starting in the chapter 21. We finished up on chapter 20, which touched on some of Steve's just human life, being a parent, meeting his parents, finding love, dating here and there. And then chapter 21 is titled Family Man at Homes with the Jobs Clan. But yeah, day 20 of becoming more well read. If you're just trying to read more, feel free to pull up a chair and tap in. I'm gonna start it off with Lauren Powell, 1991. Family Man. Okay. By this point, based on his dating history, a matchmaker could have put together a composite sketch of the women who would be right for Jobs. Smart yet unpretentious, tough enough to stand up to him, yet zen-like enough to rise above turmoil. Well educated and independent, yet ready to make accommodations for him and family. Down to earth, but with a touch of the ethereal. Savvy enough to know how to manage him, but secure enough to not always need to. And it wouldn't hurt to be a beautiful, lanky blonde with an easygoing sense of humor who liked organic vegetarian food. In October 1989, after his split with Tina Redsea, just such a woman walked into his life. More specifically, just such a woman walked into his classroom. Jobs had agreed to give one of the view from the top lectures at the Stanford Business School one Thursday evening. Lauren Powell was a new graduate student at the business school, and a guy in her class talked her into going to the lecture. They arrived late, and all the seats were taken, so they sat in the aisle. When the usher told them they had to move, Powell took her friend down to the front row and commandeered two of the reserved seats there. Jobs was led to one next to her when he arrived. I looked to my right, and there was a beautiful girl there, so we started chatting while I was waiting to be introduced. Jobs recalled they bantered a bit, and Lauren joked that she was sitting there because she had won a raffle, and the prizes was that he got to take her to dinner. He was so adorable, she later said. After the speech, Jobs hung around on the edge of the stage, chatting with students. He watched Powell leave, then come back and stand at the edge of the crowd, then leave again. He bolted out after, brushing past the dean, who was trying to grab him for a conversation. After catching up with her in the parking lot, he said, "Excuse me, wasn't there something about a raffle you won? That I'm supposed to take you to dinner?" She laughed. "How about Saturday?" he asked. She agreed and wrote down her number. Jobs headed to his car and drive up to the Thomas Fogarty Winery in the Santa Cruz Mountains above Woodside, where the Next Education Sales Group was holding a dinner. But he suddenly stopped and turned around. I thought, wow, I'd rather have dinner with her than the education group. So I ran back to her car and said, "How about dinner tonight?" She said yes. It was a beautiful fall evening, and they walked into Palo Alto to a funky vegetarian restaurant, St. Michael's Alley, and ended up staying there for 4 hours. "We've been together ever since," he said. Ivy Tevanian was sitting at the winery restaurant waiting with the rest of the Next Education group. Steve was sometimes unreliable, but when I talked to him, I realized that something special had come up. He said as soon as Powell got home after midnight, she called her close friend Catherine Cat Smith, who was at Berkeley, and left a message on her machine. "You will not believe what just happened to me." It said, "You will not believe who I met, Steve." Smith called back the next morning and heard the tale. Powell later said that she wasn't focused on meeting Jobs and that the encounter had been pure serendipity. She went only because her friend wanted to go, and she was slightly confused as to who they were going to see. "I knew that Steve Jobs was the speaker, but the face I thought of was that of Bill Gates," she recalled. "I had them mixed up. This was 1989. He was working at Next, and he was not that big of a deal to me. I wasn't that enthused, but my friend was, so we went." Lauren Powell had been born in New Jersey in 1963 and learned to be self-sufficient at an early age. Her father was a Marine Corps pilot who died a hero in a crash in Santa Ana, California. He had been leading a crippled plane in for a landing, when it hit his plane, he kept flying in an unsuccessful attempt to avoid a residential area rather than ejecting in time to save his life. His mother's second Her mother's second marriage turned out to be a horrible situation, but she felt she couldn't leave because she had no means to support her large family. For 10 years, Lauren and her three brothers had to suffer in a tense household, keeping a good demeanor while, while compartmentalizing problems. She did well. The lesson I learned was clear that I always wanted to be self-sufficient. She said, I took pride in that. My relationship with money is that it's a tool to be self-sufficient, but it's not something that is a part of who I am. After graduating from the University of Pennsylvania, she worked at Goldman Sachs as a fixed income trading strategist, dealing with enormous sums of money that she traded for the house account. John Corzine, her boss, tried to get her to stay at Goldman, but instead she decided the work was unedifying. You could be really successful, she said, but you're just contributing to capital formation. So after 3 years, she quit and went to Florence, Italy, living there for 8 months before enrolling in Stanford Business School. After their Thursday night dinner, she invited Jobs over to her Palo Alto apartment on Saturday. Cat Smith drove down from Berkeley and pretended to be her roommate so she could meet him as well. Their relationship became very passionate. They would kiss and make out, Smith said. He was enraptured with her. He would call me on the phone and ask, What do you think? Does she like me? Here I am in this bizarre position of having this iconic person call me. That New Year's Eve of 1989, the three went to Chez Panisse, the famed Alice Waters restaurant in Berkeley, along with Lisa, then 11. Something happened at the dinner that caused Jobs and Powell to start arguing. They left separately, and Powell ended up spending the night at Cat Smith's apartment. At 9 the next morning, there was a knock at the door, and Smith opened it to find Jobs standing in the drizzle, holding some wildflowers he had picked. May I come in to see Lauren? He said. She was still asleep, and he walked into the bedroom. A couple of hours went by while Smith waited in the living room, unable to go in and get her clothes. Finally, she put a coat on over her nightgown and went to Pete, Pet's, Pete's, Pete's Coffee to pick up some food. Jobs did not emerge until afternoon. Cat, can you come here for a minute? He asked. They all gathered in the bedroom. As you know, Lauren's father passed away, and Lauren's mother isn't here. And since you're her best friend, I'm going to ask you the question. He said, I'd like to marry Lauren. Will you give your blessing? Smith clambered onto the bed and thought about it. Is this okay with you? She asked Powell. When she nodded yes, Smith announced, Well, there's your answer. It was not, however, a definitive answer. Jobs had a way of focusing on something that was insane with insane intensity for a while and then abruptly turning away his gaze. At work he would focus on what he wanted to when he wanted to, and on other matters he would be unresponsive no matter how hard people tried to get him to engage. In his personal life, he was the same way. At times, he and Powell would indulge in public displays of affection that were so intense they embarrassed people in their presence, including Cat Smith and Powell's mother. In the mornings at his woodside mansion, he would wake Powell up by blasting the fine young cannibals. She drives me crazy on his tape deck. Yet at other times he would ignore her. Steve would fluctuate between intense focus, where she was the center of the universe, to being coldly distant and focused on work, said Smith. He had the power to focus like a laser beam, and when it came across you, you basked in light of his attention. When it moved to another point of focus, it was very, very dark for you. It was very confusing to Lauren. Once she had accepted his marriage proposal on the first day of 1990, he didn't mention it again for several months. Finally, Smith confronted him while they were sitting on the edge of a sandbox in Palo Alto. What was going on? Jobs replied that he needed to feel sure that Powell could handle the life he lived and the type of person he was. In September, she she became fed up with waiting and moved on. For a while, he sulked or ignored the situation. Then he thought he might still be in love with Tina Redshi. He sent her roses and tried to convince her to return to him, maybe even get married. He was not sure what he wanted, and he surprised a wide swath of friends and even acquaintances by asking them what he should do. Who was prettier? He would ask Tina or Lauren. Who did they like better? Who would he marry? In a chapter about this in Mona Simpson's novel A Regular Guy, The Jobs character asked more than 100 people who they thought was more beautiful, but that was fiction. In reality, it was probably fewer than 100. After a month of indecision, he gave Powell a diamond ring in October 1990, and she moved back in. He ended up making the right choice. As Redsey told friends, she never would have survived if she had gone back to Jobs, nor would their marriage. Even though he opined about the spiritual nature of his connection to Redsey, he had a far more solid relationship with Powell. He liked her, he loved her, he respected her, and he was comfortable with her. She would become a sensible and romantic anchor for his life. He is the luckiest guy to have landed with Lauren, who is smart and can engage him intellectually and can sustain his ups and downs and tempestuous personality, said Joanna Hoffman. Because she's not neurotic, Steve may feel that she is not as mystical as Tina or something, but that's silly. Andy Hirschfeld agreed. Lauren looks a lot like Tina, but she is totally different because she is tougher and armor plated. That's why the marriage works. Jobs understood this as well. Despite his emotional turbulence and occasional meanness, the marriage would turn out to be endearing, marked by loyalty and faithfulness, overcoming the ups and downs and jangling emotional complexities it encountered. In December, Jobs took Powell to his favorite vacation spot, Kona Village in Hawaii. He had started going there 9 years earlier when stressed out at Apple. He had asked his assistant to pick out a place for him to escape. At first glance, he didn't like the cluster of sparse thatched roof bungalows nestled on the beach on the big island of Hawaii. It was a family resort with communal eating, but within hours he had begun to view it as a paradise. There was a simplicity and spare beauty that moved him, and he returned whenever he could. He especially enjoyed being there that December with Powell. Their love had matured. That night before Christmas, he again declared, even more formally, that he wanted to marry her. Soon, soon another factor would drive that decision. While in Hawaii, Powell got pregnant. We know exactly where it happened, Jobs later said with a laugh. Okay, it's fire. Still not halfway. 272. This chapter ends on 283. I will not finish that today. Um, but it's cool to see. Um, Steve's looking in front, trying to find other things outside of like business. Um, he's struggling with business. He's struggling with Next. Um, he's able to get Pixar going barely. Um, so good that I don't know how that timeline lines up with like the 1990s to 1989. Like I'm not quite sure, but I'm hoping that everything lined up. That like by the time he was able to get that Pixar up and off the ground and running, that he was able to find Lauren as well. But who knows? We'll figure it out as we keep reading. But that was day 20 of becoming more well read. We are getting closer and closer to halfway. Then once we get halfway, we focus on finishing it or whatnot. Man. But yeah, appreciate you tapping in.